Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second Penn AI Tech webinar of our 2023-24 season. I'm Kathy Bowles, a professor of nursing at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and I'm the co-director of the Healthy Aging Core within the NIA-funded P30 called the Artificial Intelligence Collaboratory. So the Penn Artificial Intelligence and Technology Collaboratory for Healthy Aging promotes the design and innovative technology and artificial intelligence methods, hardware, and software to support older adults and those with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias in their home environment. The purpose of this webinar series, now entering its second year, is to foster a dialogue exploring clinical, ethical, and technological opportunities and challenges associated with the use of technology to promote aging and to introduce different perspectives at the intersection of informatics and gerontology. We are grateful to the National Institute of Aging for the funding to deliver this innovative program. Please post your questions to the Q&A area in the webinar throughout the presentation, and then I will facilitate the discussion at the end. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Matt McCoy is an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. Matt is a senior fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute, and along with Ari Friedman, he co-directs the Penn CMU Digital Health Privacy Initiative, which produces research on privacy and discrimination risks associated with the collection and the use of health-related digital data. His other research interests include conflicts of interest in medicine and science and the ethics of public engagement in health policymaking. Dr. McCoy, welcome, and we're very excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Kathy. Let me just share my slides, and you can let me know. Does that look okay on your end?
Beautiful, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here and talk with you all today. So I'm going to be talking through some ideas from a paper that my colleagues and I recently published in the American Journal of Bioethics. This is a good opportunity for me to say a bit about those collaborators and also a disclosure and a note about the genesis of this project. So the idea really got going with a question from somebody at Deloitte, and it was a fairly fundamental question. You know, how can companies that handle personal data do so ethically? I think there's a shared sense among Deloitte, among many of the companies that they work with as clients, that, you know, the formal and informal ethical standards that we have right now built up around data use are insufficient, but there's less certainty about what the right path forward was. So that was sort of our brief and what we set out to work on. So we got a bit of money from Deloitte just to support the costs of convening a working group to think about this, but they weren't involved in any way in the project or the publication that unfolded after that. So as Kathy said, I'm in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. My two co-authors on this, Dr. Jaffe and Dr. Emanuel, are in the same department. Professor Allen, Professor Mello, Professor Osorio are all legal scholars. Professor Allen here at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, all legal scholars, but with deep expertise in bioethics and health policy as well. We wanted to make sure that in the group we put together to think about these issues, that it wasn't just folks from inside the academy. So DJ Patil was formerly the US Chief Data Scientist under Obama, but before that and after that has had a long career in industry, so he helped bring that perspective and some of those considerations to our work. And Katerina Kopp is the Deputy Director at the Center for Digital Democracy, so brings more of a consumer advocacy perspective to these issues. But actually, before she started that role, she had also had a career in industry, so can speak to that perspective as well. So just one quick note about scoping, both in the title of the paper and throughout my talk, you'll hear me refer to personal information or personal data. What we took as our operational definition of that for the purpose of the paper was this one that comes from the California Consumer Privacy Act. So personal information is any information that identifies, relates to, or could reasonably be linked with an individual or household including inferences from other personal information that could create a profile about one's preferences and characteristics. There's been a lot of people in our world, in medicine and nursing, who have done, I think, really good work trying to map out ethical considerations that should inform the use of sort of specifically health-related data. We took this broader approach. We thought it was appropriate here, given the increasingly blurred line between health and non-health related data, especially in an age of AI-enabled technologies. I'm sure many on this call are well aware that, disparate pieces of information about us, even things that are seemingly trivial or seemingly unrelated to health, can be sort of linked together to reveal potentially sensitive details about our health or other personal attributes. So that's why you'll hear me talking about personal information rather than health information, though it certainly encompasses information that is distinctly health related. So the plan for my talk today, I want to start with a little bit of background about, what's the problem? Why did we get together to think about this issue? Talk about our current privacy protection regime in the United States and why it has shortcomings. Then I'll talk about sort of what we produce. So first, what we think would be an appropriate set of foundational principles for ethical data practices, and then talk about how those can be mapped onto practical imperatives for companies that collect and use personal information. And then close with a bit of an implementation scenario that we work through in the paper, where we imagine a hypothetical developer of a mental health app trying to put into practice some of the recommendations that we make in the paper. So, okay, let me start with this first part. What's the problem? I think it's nicely summed up in these recent polling results. This is from an Ipsos survey last year. And you can see right there in the top line finding a feeling that, I'm certainly familiar with, and maybe many of you are as well. Most Americans say it's increasingly difficult to control who can access their data. The little subtitle there, the next line, is something I want to put a pin in and come back. This idea that despite these concerns, few are taking steps to actually protect their personal information online. I think there's a slightly more complicated story to tell there, but I'll come to that a little bit later in the presentation. But just to walk through some of their high-level findings from this survey to set the table for my talk today. So you can see in the first row, almost 3/4 of the people that they talked to said, they have this feeling that it's become more difficult to control who has access to my personal information online. It's certainly something that I feel and I think about quite a bit. This is obviously a problem for people who are concerned about the way their data is being used. It's, potentially a problem for the companies that are collecting and using this data as well, insofar as it suggests some reputational or trust concerns. Only around 33% of people, a third of the folks who responded to this survey, felt like companies were doing a good job of protecting their users' personal information. And something that you hear in this context is that, well, people understand that they maybe have less privacy than they would like online, but on balance, they're sort of happy with the trade-offs. They understand that this is just the cost of doing business for the services and the products that they really like. But I think the results in this survey actually belie that a little bit. So, one of the things they asked, having free access to online search engines is worth allowing tech companies to collect and share my personal data. Only about 1/4 of people agreed with that. Similarly, when it comes to social media apps, having access to these platforms is worth allowing companies to collect and share my data. Again, most people say no to that. Skipping down to the bottom line, seeing personalized advertisements is worth allowing companies to collect and share my online activity. Now, this is something you hear quite a bit. You hear from Facebook and other advertising platforms that, targeted advertising, it's actually helpful to consumers because it, makes sure that they are seeing advertisements that are tailored to them and give them useful information. But again, I think the results of this survey belie that. Most people feel like the trade-off really isn't worth it. And then popping up to the penultimate row there, you can see they asked whether current data privacy laws do a good enough job of ensuring citizens' data privacy rights. Most people say no, and I want to come back to that at the end of the presentation, because I think, I'll make some suggestions here for things that companies can do better, but ultimately the way to get kind of robust and consistent privacy protection is going to require congressional action. So people are certainly concerned about this. What are some of the underlying ethical concerns that are making them uncomfortable with the way their data is being used? Obviously, there's many things that we could probably brainstorm about together. Just an illustrative list of some of the concerns that that might be driving this this stress. There are what we sometimes call dignitary harms, and it can be hard to sort of define what these are precisely, but I think it captures a really important intuition. Price and Cohen had a really nice piece in Nature in 2019 examining this idea of dignitary harms. And the idea is essentially that, to have dignity, it's important that there are parts of your life that are closed off to the outside world unless you allow others to see them. And the fact that people can read these sensitive details about you from your online activity, from your digital footprint, it is a violation of that fundamental sense of dignity, even if it's not the case that, that leads to subsequent downstream harms like discrimination, things I'll talk about in a second. Subjective harm, similarly. So, subjective harm would refer to a feeling of distress or anxiety or embarrassment or shame at the thought that, this information about you might be revealed, or maybe it has been revealed. You could imagine a situation in which somebody's using a shared computer, and for example, the targeted advertisements start, suggesting to other co-users of that computer some embarrassing details about the health or the lifestyle of somebody, and that kind of thing can, understandably cause quite a bit of subjective distress. Looking a little bit further downstream to the ways in which this information can be used, there are concerns about misleading and manipulative advertising that can be facilitated by data profiling that's then used to target advertisements at people. We obviously hear a lot about this during presidential election cycles, so be prepared to start hearing about it soon. But of course, during the COVID pandemic, there was concern about targeted advertising potentially being a vector for health misinformation. And then there are concerns about, profiling and risk scoring, using information from somebody's digital footprint to, inform a decision about their credit worthiness, or discriminating in who gets shown ads for things like jobs or housing opportunities. So, some of you may have followed Facebook's ongoing struggles in this area. Was revealed a few years ago that they were letting housing advertisers exclude users by race, and that's the sort of thing that's facilitated by the kind of rampant data tracking that we have online. So it's not as if we have no privacy protection regime in the United States. We do have one, and the dominant regime in the United States and many other jurisdictions is one of notice and consent. And I suspect many are familiar with this idea, but the basic model is that individuals are given rights to notice and consent regarding the collection and use of their personal data. And with that comes this, implied choice of you can decide how, with whom, under what terms you want to disclose your data. So, something like the ubiquitous cookie notification is an example of notice and consent. You go to a website, you get this message. Maybe you can go into the preferences and turn on and off some of the cookies. You usually can't turn off all of them, but you're basically, given a link to the privacy policy, and it's kind of buyer beware. You can make a decision whether or not you want to use that website, that platform, after understanding what they're going to do with your personal data. And I do think that there is some intuitive appeal to this. It's grounded in respect for individual autonomy and appreciation of the fact that different people are going to have reasonably different preferences about how concerned they are about their privacy, what they're willing to give up in exchange for certain goods and services. So you can kind of understand, at least in principle, why this seems like a nice way to handle privacy for a jurisdiction as diverse as the United States, where people have very different fundamental values. But what I want to say, what we say in the paper, and certainly we're not the first to make these observations, but I'll talk you through some of our reasoning, is that the notice and consent paradigm is really fundamentally flawed, both in its underlying justification, this narrow focus on individual autonomy as the focal value for data protection, and in its practical application, the way in which it tries to operationalize respect for individual autonomy in a set of procedures. So let me start with that first part about the underlying justification for notice and consent. I think the problem with using individual autonomy as the sole ethical foundation for thinking about data protection is that decisions to disclose my personal information, they're actually rarely purely personal. And what I mean by that is that one's personal information, again, especially in an AI-enabled world, supports inferences about others. So we don't exist in isolation. We exist in social groups. We exist in networks. And when a company learns information about me, they're not really interested in learning information about me. What they ultimately want to do is learn information about people like me. It helps them message, it helps them target people in that group. So ultimately, every time I share a bit of information, I'm not just sharing something about myself, I'm actually sharing another set of data points that can help third parties sort of understand more about people in my group, not just myself. So I think it makes sense to really think that our decisions to disclose personal information, they're not just about ourselves. They actually implicate a wide range of interests, and they're not justifiable strictly by appeal to informed consent. Some economists have actually suggested that we should think about privacy as a public good in the sense of something that's non-rival and non-excludable. So when all our data is kept more confidential, privacy is something that we can all enjoy together because companies don't have access to these individual data points that let them generate broader inferences. And then, within that framework of thinking about privacy as a public good, you can think about individual choices to disclose information as having sort of privacy externalities, which is to say, costs that are borne by others, not necessarily just by the person who decides to disclose something. So, from that perspective, saying that individual consent is all that matters, you can see that there's really a mismatch there. But even if we set that concern aside and we assume that, really what does matter is sort of realizing individual autonomy, the problem is the way that individual autonomy is, hoped to be realized or operationalized in the notice and consent paradigm. It just doesn't really work. So, from an ethical perspective, we tend to think that to make consent ethically meaningful, it needs to meet a couple of conditions. And one of those conditions is that it needs to be voluntary, which is to say, you have to actually have a reasonable choice not to do the thing that you're being asked to consent to. And there's all sorts of ways in which we don't actually have that reasonable choice when it comes to our online lives. So Kathy mentioned my work with the Penn CMU Digital Health Privacy Initiative. This is some work we did. So we looked at basically all the hospital websites in the United States, and we found that virtually all of them include third-party tracking technologies that send user data out to third parties. And it's not just one or two third parties that's receiving the data. We found that on hospital homepages, there's a median of 16 data transfers out to third parties. And it's not just something that where hospitals are installing these tracking technologies on their homepage so that people might know just the bare fact that somebody visited the page. We found virtually no difference between the number of these tracking technologies on hospital homepages and symptom-specific pages for things like depression, Alzheimer's disease, HIV, breast cancer. So essentially, what you're telling a consumer is, okay, you can make a choice. You can go to these hospital websites, you'll be exposed to these privacy risks, or you can not use the hospital website. But that's really not a choice. A hospital website is a digital front door to the healthcare system. So you're essentially saying the only way to protect your privacy is not to walk through it. And that's not really a choice. And of course, this is only one area in which it's extremely hard, if not impossible, to kind of unilaterally opt out of the data economy. Some of you may know the tech reporter for the New York Times, Kashmir Hill. She did this really interesting experiment where she tried to see if she could cut out the big tech giants, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, out of her life. And you can see in the headline, she found it virtually impossible. The other condition that consent needs to meet to be ethically meaningful is that it needs to be informed, and in principle the way that happens through notice and consent is that you're given a privacy policy that lays out the terms of use for your data on a site or an app that you're interacting with. But as you all know, these privacy policies, they're long, they're dense, they're legalistic, and there's just a lot of them that you're going to encounter in your digital life today. So you can see this piece in The Atlantic drawing on some research that had been done where the investigators calculated that it would take you 76 work days. So, basically your summer vacation, if you wanted to try to read all the privacy policies that you encountered in a year. And when you think about this from a larger scale, the kind of opportunity cost of having people do that to try to protect their privacy, they calculated that it would cost $781 billion. So again, you can, in principle, I suppose, become informed by reading a privacy policy, but the number of them that you run into just makes that a practical impossibility. And I should also point out that this was over a decade ago, so I don't know if these numbers have been updated, but I would assume that if anything, the number of policies and the time it would take you to navigate them has only increased over the last decade. So I think all of this put together, we end up in this situation, which was really nicely summarized in this headline of a recent Atlantic article, where we're slouching towards accepting all cookies because we're just sort of beaten down by the sheer volume of all this that we're confronted with and the challenge of trying to navigate it. And a concept that you sometimes hear in this context, it was maybe reflected in that Ipsos headline I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, is this idea of a privacy paradox, where when you ask people, do you care about your privacy online? They all say, yes, absolutely. But then it's apparently a paradox because what we do online, we engage in all these services that track us really ceaselessly, seems to belie what we said we actually care about. But I don't really think that's the right framing for some of the reasons that I mentioned. And actually, colleagues at Penn, you can see this really fantastic report that they produced recently about Americans being unable to consent to companies' use of their data. Rather than the privacy paradox, they develop a really nice concept called digital resignation, which basically just says, yes, we do want a better alternative. We would like to live our online lives without being tracked mercilessly. But we can't do that. And we can't just unilaterally opt out because we need to do things like use our email, make an appointment with our doctor, view our test results online. So we have to resign ourselves to this unfortunate situation. But there's really not a paradox there. There's just, the choice of, one of many bad options. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we think a better looking framework would look like, but just to close the loop on this before moving forward and circle back to these Ipsos findings, so as I showed you, their kind of top line conclusion was that people don't seem to do that much to protect their privacy. I actually think the results they have paint a slightly more complicated picture of that. So you can see different steps that one might take to protect their privacy. And actually the basic stuff, people are trying to do. So they're keeping their software updated, they're using different passwords, they're even clearing browser and cookie history. When it comes to things like using an incognito browser, you start to see a fall off, but for good reason. It's much harder to navigate the internet that way. Some sites won't even work for you. Using a VPN, I think about this stuff quite a bit, and I don't even use a VPN most of the time when I'm using public Wi-Fi, using encrypted messaging platforms. So, sure, there are things that would really, kind of be on the order of heroic efforts that people could take to protect their privacy. Even with that, we still see a third and upwards of people saying that they do these kinds of things. But I do think this shows that people are trying, but they're basically out of resources and out of time to do more to protect their privacy. So what we really need is a framework that doesn't leave all the burden on the consumer, which is where it is right now. So what would a better framework look like? I think thinking about the limitations of notice and consent suggests a couple of things. The first is that a better framework needs a broader ethical basis that reflects the social impact of data practices. It can't all rest on this idea of, we need to respect individual choice, individual autonomy. And the second thing is it needs to be the case that whatever those principles are that we think are important can be mapped to some practical steps. I showed you, even if you accept the value of individual autonomy is really important, it doesn't look like notice and consent checkboxes are actually a very good way of operationalizing that. So these are the kind of goals that we set out to meet in thinking through this project. So let me start with the foundational principles that we ended up settling on. And we wanted to have a pretty parsimonious list here to keep things not overwhelmingly theoretically complex. So some people in considering this issue have sort of assumed that, given how novel the data economy is, how complex, multifaceted data flows are today, that we really need a brand new set of ethical principles for thinking about this. And we actually had long conversations about that, but we ultimately disagreed. We ended up feeling like, at least at the level of first principles, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel here. We do, and I'll try to show you this in talking through some imperatives for companies. We do think that understanding and unpacking the implications of these principles for data users in this modern system required some new and novel thinking. But I think actually principles that we're all pretty familiar with can serve as a pretty good ethical basis here. So you can see we came up with 3 substantive principles. These will be familiar with folks who know the Belmont report, for example: minimizing harm, fairly distributing benefits and burdens, and respecting individual autonomy. And then we added to that some procedural principles. There aren't procedural principles, for example, in the Belmont report, but I'll explain why we think that those are pretty important in this context. So let me start with minimizing harm. Now, we had a conversation when we started doing this work about whether the principle should be something like minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, or minimizing harm and optimizing benefit. We ultimately ended up with something more asymmetrical, just looking at minimizing harm. I think because our thought was that, if you say something like companies that collect data have an obligation to maximize benefit, I mean, maybe you want to say that, but that would carry, pretty sweeping implications for what they choose to develop in terms of products, where their business area even is. And maybe some would want to go further and say that private companies do have an obligation to sort of maximize public good or something in what they choose to work on. But we ultimately decided that we weren't going to go that far for this. But we did say that, over the different areas that they end up doing work on, companies that collect and use personal data, they do have this obligation to try to minimize harm. And that requires, a range of different things in concrete cases, but formulated at a general level, we think it means structuring the collection and use of personal data to facilitate valuable data practices while mitigating risks of discrimination, exploitation, other harms. So, this principle would imply that data practices whose harms outweigh their benefits are just ethically unacceptable. But even data practices that do advance legitimate sort of individual or collective interests should try to be designed and carried out in a way that minimizes risks to individuals and groups. So fairly distributing benefits and burdens, right? This is a distributional principle. This is a principle about justice or equity, if you like. It's not just about the overall balance of benefits and burdens, but who ultimately bears them. So this, of course, requires attention to the ways in which data practices may exacerbate patterns of social disadvantage or exploit certain groups to the benefit of the others. So the way that we thought about this is that, it would entail some negative obligations, things like modifying or avoiding data practices that disproportionately burden or discriminate against groups. But it could also entail some positive obligations. So things like, promoting equitable access to beneficial services or products that are created. And then lastly, for the substantive principles, we did think that respecting individual autonomy, which, as I said, is the kind of sole value undergirding the notice and consent system, we did think that it had a place in a broader ethical framework as long as it wasn't the only value. So this kind of comes from the assumption that, people shouldn't be able to just consent to data practices that are going to be on balance harmful or exploitative. But we think that, in most cases, there is going to be a range of ethically permissible data practices, and that individuals should be able to make a choice about whether or not they want to engage in those particular practices. But again, going back to some of the limitations of notice and consent, right? This can't just be a formal choice. Really giving this principle of respect for individual autonomy kind of meaning and teeth requires that people have effective opportunities for voluntary and informed choices, and that companies have to honor those. So, an example of this, you can see a screenshot here from 23andMe, the consumer genetics company website. I don't think we would want to say, nobody in the group wanted to say that, the need to protect personal privacy means that there can never be any secondary use of data. So things like using data secondarily for genetics research that might help, deliver new cures, new therapies, that's important, and people should be given a real opportunity to decide if they want to share that data and share their data to be part of that process. But I'll talk a little bit later about how we think that could happen in a way that would actually sort of give people real choice, as opposed to, bearing some line in the privacy policy that no reasonable person is ever going to get to. So those are the substantive principles. As I say, I think I'll talk about the application of those to this context, but I think the principles themselves are probably pretty familiar to most people, and I think we can discuss how to balance them in particular cases, but none of those principles on their own is particularly controversial, I would think. But we also thought that procedural principles needed to be a part of this. So procedural principle, it's not about the substantive considerations that are being weighed and traded off in decisions about data. But these are principles that try to specify how companies ought to make decisions about data collection and use. So this may be less familiar to some folks on the call. So why do we need these kinds of procedural principles? So one reason is that substantive principles require balancing against each other in concrete cases. So, for instance, distributing harms in an equitable manner across groups in a population, that might mean that you're not minimizing harm for any particular group, right? So there's a kind of trade-off there, and you want to think through it. And the procedural principles try to specify a good way to think through that. They can also function as ethical guardrails in the context of asymmetrical power relations. So what we're really getting at here is that, of course, the companies that collect our data have so much more information, so many more resources, so much more power than we have. And it's all well and good for them to say, okay, we accept these substantive principles and we're trying to kind of have them inform our decision making. But with doing that, they still sort of loom above us as a dominating power that we don't have much access to. So, procedural principles that can help open up those decisions to scrutiny or challenge from the outside, they're certainly not going to level the playing field, but maybe can act as a bit of a check on those asymmetrical power relations. And you'll see that a lot of procedural principles I talk about kind of have that function. And then lastly, they can support the substantive principles. So if you're making decisions according to these procedural principles, it ideally makes it more likely that you're going to achieve the substantive principles that we think are important. So what are the principles? Again, I think, at the level of first principles, hopefully there's not a lot that's new here to people. So, transparency. This means that companies should disclose relevant information about their data practices, purposes that they collect and use data for, who they're sharing it with, the risks that they foresee, and efforts that they've taken to mitigate those risks. Transparency is necessary, but not sufficient for achieving accountability. So accountability is really beyond transparency, requires standards for behavior and the creation of mechanisms by which organizations can be sanctioned if they fail to meet those standards. And the goal here is really to make companies answerable to the communities their practices affect. So, sanctions can be things like reputational sanctions. I shared the Facebook investigation earlier in the presentation, right? So Facebook paid some reputational costs for having data practice that many people rightly saw as discriminatory. But sanctions, and I'll talk about this at the end of the presentation, ultimately are probably more effective when they're imposed in the form of fines or other legal penalties by public regulators. And then lastly, we thought about this procedural principle of inclusion, right? Of sort of voice, of bringing in people from outside the organization. And this principle is requiring that members of effective groups should have a meaningful opportunity to shape the policies of companies that collect and use their personal data in the industries of which they're a part. So, there are some ways that companies can do this. There have been some experiments of sort of representative assemblies of users that companies have tried to put together. That kind of thing is, of course, very prone to kind of tokenism and weakness. So I think it's a recommendation for something that companies should strive for. But again, ultimately, really kind of institutionalizing and making robust the principle of inclusion is going to require some outside regulation. So, okay. Those are, again, as I said, kind of first principles. And I think when we're ultimately sort of debating the ethical permissibility of different data practices, it's important to come back to those as the ultimate sort of foundation over which we're making our decision. But of course, for companies that, decision makers inside companies who aren't thinking about ethics all day, it can be a little bit difficult to drive decision making at the level of first principles. So what we wanted to do is try to translate those into some practical imperatives that would be a little bit more straightforwardly action guiding, but we think advance those underlying principles that are ultimately what we're trying to achieve. So we came up with 5. I'll talk through all of them individually and then try to show how they can all come together in this kind of implementation context where we imagine a hypothetical developer of a mental health app trying to put them into practice. So minimize collection and retention of personal data, offer fewer but more meaningful choices about data, provide meaningful disclosure, assess the social impact of data practices, and ensure meaningful stakeholder engagement. So first, minimize collection and retention of personal data. And really, I think this just is a foundational first step towards anything that looks like a better privacy protection regime than the one that we have right now. You could sum this up as it was in a recent piece in the New York Times: just collect less data, period. So what would this mean for companies? Limit data collection, use, and retention to what is necessary to provide a requested product or service, or what is reasonably anticipated in the context of a company's relationship with an individual. What principles does this sort of realize or emphasize? So we think doing this actually helps with these distributional concerns, fairly distributing benefits and burdens. And the reason we think that, it might not be immediately obvious, but we think that when you lower the costs of controlling one's data, you help those people who have the least amount of time, the least amount of resources, the least amount of wherewithal to manage their data in the current environment. So there's a little bit of leveling the playing field so that people who are sort of overwhelmed and don't have the resources to navigate choices right now might be put on slightly better footing if they're just, they're not forced to contend with so much because less data about them is being collected and held for extremely long periods of time. We also think this respects individual autonomy because, people are able to sort of focus on things that really matter to them when you sort of take away a lot of the noise, you take away a lot of the just kind of rampant data collection of every sort that's happening at all times. We also think it's important, so we didn't lose this idea of choice that informs the notice and consent paradigm, but hopefully we kind of rethought it in a helpful way. We think that what companies should strive to do is offer fewer but more meaningful choices about data. So there's a couple ways in which this can happen. One is just eliminating the sharing or sale of personal data for low value uses. So, one of those things might be targeted advertising. I showed you from the Ipsos poll, people really don't like targeted advertising. That's a result that's been reproduced in basically any public survey that asks people how they feel about this. Something people often say is that, well, you get rid of targeted advertising, you're going to hurt publishers because their ad revenue is going to drop. You're going to hurt small businesses because they really rely on the advertising. And it's something we could talk about in the Q&A, but based on the way I read the data, I think there just isn't that strong a case that targeted advertising, given all its privacy costs, is that much better than contextual advertising, which is just advertising based on the content of the page you're looking at, as opposed to data points that have been collected and stored about you. So, this is the thesis of this piece, which, this is somebody with some skin in the game. This is the CEO of DuckDuckGo, which is a privacy-focused web browser. But, there certainly is a possibility that we could just sell non-creepy, which is to say non-targeted advertising. Okay, so, what constitutes a low-value data use is something that's going to have to be judged and adjudicated in particular contexts. But there's certainly room to cut out some low-value data practices. Of course, there are going to be some, like, the 23andMe example that I shared earlier. Data practices that we do want to make sure that we preserve. And I think then it's incumbent upon companies, when sharing data for these kinds of socially valuable purposes, to make greater use of opt-in models that limit data sharing by default. One concern that people sometimes raise about this is, well, if you do opt-in, people aren't going to do it, and then you're not going to get people opting into genetic research when they sign up for 23andMe, and it's going to be a huge hit to research, and we're not going to have the same kind of therapies and medical development that we would with a default opt-out model. The experience of 23andMe and other consumer genetics companies, I think, challenges that. So 23andMe, I believe, says 80% of people who use the service opt in to share their data for research. So the idea that if we do this, nobody will ever sign up for socially valuable data sharing is, I think, an overblown concern. And similar to the first practical imperative, this has the same general direction of trying to lower burdens on individuals, which we think helps with fairness. We think helps with individual autonomy by letting people focus their choice on what matters most, as opposed to being overwhelmed with 45 are you okay with cookies choices during the day that just ends up with a bunch of decision fatigue. Disclosure. I talked about the ways in which privacy policies themselves are not really a scalable solution in the modern data economy, because there's just too many people out there trying to use our data. But there still is a place for disclosure. And this is an idea that we adopted from Cameron Carey and colleagues at the Brookings Institute, where they suggest, there's room for a kind of thinking about a sort of a two-track approach to disclosure. So you have really succinct consumer-facing data use statements and notifications that, in as tight a package as possible, give people information about how their data is being used that might actually be actionable for them. Then at the same time, companies would be expected to publish comprehensive privacy policies that can be assessed by third parties. So I have a screenshot here from Ranking Digital Rights, where these kind of third parties can really dig into privacy policies, terms of use, and present the information in a digestible format that policymakers can look at or consumers could actually use to inform their decisions. And I think actually when we talk about disclosure in this space, there can sometimes be a tendency to think about individuals and companies and omitting the really crucial role that third-party actors can play here. So I think this sort of two-track approach can facilitate that. We think that doing this, it promotes the value of respecting individual autonomy, and of course promotes the value of transparency. Assess the social impact of data practices. So the idea of doing privacy impact assessments has been around for quite a while. The idea of a social impact assessment is, you do look at the privacy implications of a particular data practice, but you also look more broadly. You also look at, to the extent that you can assess them, the harms and benefits of that data practice, any disparities in terms of how the burdens of that data practice are falling across different populations. And there has been ideas like this introduced in recent legislation. So it's a 2019 bill. I think it didn't make it out of committee, but the Consumer Online Privacy Act, provision in this bill was that there would be a requirement for companies that do algorithmic decision making to do a kind of annual bias assessment of their algorithm. So this, it may seem like a big ask, but this is actually something that companies are already doing and is already part of legislation. And so what we think this would require, companies could do this more prospectively, so using a checklist process prior to product launch to identify and mitigate risks associated with new products. But also it needs to be something that's ongoing, sort of in the way that it was in the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act, the bill that I just mentioned, where there's a kind of periodic or annual review of the company's data practices with a focus in particular on identifying and correcting practices that burden members of disadvantaged groups. So, more widespread uptake of this kind of approach could certainly minimize harm and help, again, with these distributional concerns. I've just got one more practical imperative to talk through, and then I'll sort of put it all together, as I said, in the context of a hypothetical company, and hopefully have at least 10 minutes or so for discussion at the end of the talk. So ensure meaningful stakeholder engagement. What would this look like? It could be involving members of the public and other external experts in the kind of social impact assessments I just talked about. Could involve creating standing bodies to allow for ongoing input from users and affected groups. As I said before, there is a high chance of tokenism here, but in principle, these are things that companies could do. My colleague on this paper, Michelle Mello and Glenn Cohen, have written about hospitals potentially creating data use committees that would involve patients from that hospital that make decisions about whether or not the hospital is going to share EHR data with a tech company, for instance, that wants to use it to develop new AI products. Again, though, I think really sort of institutionalizing and making stakeholder engagement robust is probably something that will require government action. But doing this could help to bring about the principles of accountability and inclusion that I talked about. So what does this all look like? We put it together. So, you could imagine the developer of a mental health app, maybe they read the paper, they think it's fantastic. It might seem like I sort of gave a huge litany of things that no company could possibly do, but hopefully when I talk through this, you could see that, these are the kinds of things that are not happening consistently now, but could be the kinds of things that form a cornerstone of a regulatory framework that's eventually, put into law. So let me just talk through some of these ideas. So ensure meaningful stakeholder engagement. What could that look like? So beginning in the product development phase, the company convenes external stakeholders, patients, mental health professionals, eventually maybe beta users of the app, to shape the app's data privacy settings and controls, and they review any potential data sharing arrangements. What would it look like to minimize collection and retention of personal data? So the company identifies, they continually reassess what types of personal information are necessary to the functioning of the app. They try to ensure that there's a reasonable justification for any data that they're collecting, and that they're not collecting superfluous information or unnecessarily requiring users to link their account to other online profiles, which is something that unfortunately happens all too often. What does it mean to offer fewer but more meaningful choices about data? So we could say that maybe the rule is by default, users' personal information is not shared. But, as with the kind of 23andMe case, users can be given the opportunity to share their personal data with vetted research partners. In these cases, the company would be required to present users with clear statements on the risks and benefits of research, as well as any instructions for how they could stop data sharing if they decide they no longer want to do it. Meaningful transparency. So this is a great opportunity for kind of consumer engagement to bring people in to help develop succinct, accessible, digestible statements that address the types of data that will be collected by the app, how the data is used, and the terms, if any, under which it would be shared. And then, finally, assessing the social impact of the data practices. So prior to product launch, the company could use a checklist to assess and mitigate risks associated with the app, ensure that it is meeting the needs of its target users, which is important as well. I talked about these kind of positive obligations to make sure that there's kind of equitable access to products that are actually good and useful. Once the product is launched, company convenes stakeholders to review and correct practices that may stigmatize patients, lead to discrimination, otherwise harm individuals. So, I think in isolation, it seems like a lot, but actually none of this we didn't think would sort of fundamentally compromise the business model of an app developer, and could be something that's actually like quite appealing and a market advantage for consumers who, as we saw from the polling data, are really concerned about the way that their personal information is being used. So this is my final slide. There's a lot more that could be said about this, but I didn't want to leave on a note that would suggest that we think sort of like self-regulation and companies being better actors is all we need here. Ultimately, self-regulation, I think at best we can say it's an incremental step towards better practices, and it's a step worth taking in light of the fact that it's been difficult to pass privacy legislation. Companies ultimately their bottom line is generating financial returns. They do have some incentives to self-regulate. I talked about reputational costs. Those reputational costs can be increased by third-party organizations like Ranking Digital Rights or investigative journalists who sort of shine a light on practices that consumers would find undesirable. Some companies, as I just mentioned, might actually find market opportunities to target privacy-focused consumers with better privacy protections, a set of ethical regulations that sort of mirrors what I just presented in the presentation here. Sometimes they have incentives that stem from their fear of more onerous public regulation if they don't get their act together, or maybe they sort of know public regulation is coming, but starting to reform their practices now can reduce downstream compliant costs. But as I've said a couple of times, ensuring consistent, reliable compliance with ethical data practices. We have a long enough history of failed efforts at self-regulation to know that this is ultimately going to require government action. You can see these are from this is from a Morning Consult poll. I'm sorry, I guess I left the logo off there, but you can see there's actually a lot of bipartisan support for comprehensive privacy legislation, and you can't say that about a lot of things in American political life. Last Congress, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act was voted out of the Energy and Commerce Committee by something like a 53-1 or 53-2 margin. So like remarkably bipartisan effort in the Congress. It didn't make it off the floor of Congress. So there's still work to be done there. There's a lot of concern about, preemption. States that have passed their own privacy laws are worried about what a federal privacy law would mean. So there's work left to be done. I certainly don't want to be Pollyanna-ish and suggest that something like this is right around the corner. But there is enthusiasm for it, and hopefully, the kinds of recommendations that we lay out here, as I said, they can be, we think, immediately taken up by companies that are sort of intrinsically or extrinsically motivated by the pressure that they're feeling, but ultimately could also form cornerstones of, public privacy regulation if and when we hopefully get something like that on the federal level. So I will leave it there. I'm sorry if I went on a little bit too long, but hopefully we have time for a little bit of conversation here in the last 10 minutes or so.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy. All right, so we do have some questions from the audience. The first one is, how is the governance ownership shared or separated based on consented first-party data versus second or third-party data?
So is the question, how is ownership shared between the people who the data is about and the companies that are ultimately collecting and sharing that data?
I believe so.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and it's ultimately something that we thought about, but not a road that we really went down. So there are some approaches to data privacy and data ethics that really emphasize sort of personal ownership as a framework for thinking about individual rights. The reason we didn't go down that road is because some of the appeals of personal data ownership, this is something actually that Web3 people talk about a lot, with sort of having your data on the blockchain so that individuals can receive some kind of compensation when their data is used. Some of that does seem like maybe a way to address fairness concerns or exploitation concerns to make sure that people are getting something out of this. But ultimately, the kind of individual ownership model feels like an extension of the sort of individual rights model that underlies the notice and consent paradigm. So, we ended up going in a different direction where we wanted to think about this as much more of a public concern and something where onus is put on companies and regulators, hopefully, as opposed to individual co-owners of their data. I hope that's helpful, but it maybe betrays the fact that this isn't something that we went far down that road, as I said.
Okay, thank you. Do you see a larger role for the NIH or the National Science Foundation in regulation of product development and research? They don't seem to be on top of this beyond IRB protections. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a good question. Potentially, but I think in some ways, NIH or NSF funded researchers are, in many cases, have access to sensitive personal data. But I think, I don't exactly know what the scale is, but I would say when we look at the kind of ocean of personal data collectors and users, those that have federal grants are probably a drop in the bucket. So I think that could be helpful, and to the extent that these funding agencies can incentivize or more strongly than that compel grant recipients to have better data practices, they ought to do it. But ultimately what we're talking about here is a lot of private actors that the NIH and the NSF aren't going to have leverage over. So ultimately the regulatory burden seems, there's different legislation. Some has suggested that these are, it should be sort of in the purview of the FTC with some increased authorities, or I had a little, I didn't talk about it, but a headline on that last slide. Elizabeth Warren has recently introduced legislation that would, create a new kind of digital consumer protection agency. So whether it's the FTC with some kind of expanded resources and authorities or a novel agency, I do think it needs to be something broader than just the federal research funders, making sure that those that get federal money are doing right by the people whose data they're stewarding.
Thank you. Would you please comment on the Electronic Frontier Foundation?
I'm not exactly sure what the direction of that question. I've found them to be a helpful resource in the past. I think they have good explainers. I think they've even developed some plugins and products that consumers can use. I think Privacy Badger, which is like one of these tracking blockers, is a product that was developed or developed in collaboration with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So I'm not an expert in the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but I found them to be useful. And I actually, to tie this back actually to the talk a little bit more explicitly, organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Ranking Digital Rights, which I mentioned, I do think are, at least that type of third-party organization is really important in kind of breaking this stuff down and presenting it to consumers in a way that they can really understand the stakes. Because when you just have an individual looking at privacy policies, it's sort of overwhelming. So I think that those kinds of organizations play really important functions. And I'm sorry I can't be more articulate about the about EFF than that.
Okay, sounded good to me. Thank you, Matt. Another question: do your proposed principles apply equally to consumer data versus health or financial data?
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, we really wanted to think about this in the broadest possible terms as, these should be principles for companies that collect, that process, that use personal data, which would include those specific categories that you just meant. Now, of course, that's not to deny that certain kinds of data are intrinsically more sensitive than others. Of course, health data, financial data, and of course, the relative sensitivity of different kinds of data should be reflected and taken into account in the kind of social impact assessments that I talked about. But I think we were wary of trying to say a priori, well, some kinds of data, it's just completely innocuous. What you watch on Netflix or something, or what books you read, that's completely innocuous. And I just think it's increasingly hard to cleave anything off as being totally unproblematic at the outset, because as I said, what AI and pattern recognition allows is putting together a whole bunch of seemingly trivial or disparate pieces of information about us to form a really comprehensive picture of who we are. So yes, I do think that those categories you mentioned are more important, but we didn't want to go the other way and say that, well, these are low concern, we don't really need to worry about them, we can just think about health data. Because I think even what constitutes health data, when you think broadly about social determinants, it's very hard to understand where that boundary is. Where I live, what I eat, that's all health data, right? That all ultimately bears on my health. Yeah, it's a good question.
True. Okay. So one of the persons commented in the Q&A that the access to sharing your health information doesn't seem to be clear on hospital websites. And so is there a standard for that kind of consent of how health data will be used for patients, or is that not standardized in any way?
Well, so the hospital thing is tricky. There's certainly a standard for HIPAA protected data, and then the kind of web tracking that I talked about when I briefly showed that study that we did, it's a little bit ambiguous, right? Because this could be information like your IP address and the fact that you had visited, the breast cancer page, or read about specialists at that hospital treating depression. So it could be like that bundle of information sent to a third party. STAT in the markup actually did an investigative report where they showed that sometimes the data transfers that we identified at a high level actually included things like doctors' names, appointment time, so like clearly identifiable information. And actually after, we did some of this work looking at these marketing trackers on hospital websites, and the Office of Civil Rights, which is the body within HHS that oversees HIPAA, they put out a guidance bulletin saying, actually, like hospitals, you should be a little careful about this. I think maybe the understanding was like these kinds of tracking technologies, sure, they're kind of transferring consumer data, but not HIPAA protected data. And in this guidance, OCR said, it's actually not how we see it. And we think that in a lot of cases, actually, the data that's being transferred off of these websites probably does include PHI and therefore does implicate HIPAA. So yeah, health data, HIPAA, absolutely. There, strict rules around how it's sold and or how it's shared, and who it can be shared with and for what uses. This whole kind of not traditionally thought of as HIPAA, but sort of second level of data that hospitals can gather about us through the way we interact with their online platforms. I think people used to think that wasn't covered, but OCR says now it actually might be covered by HIPAA. So that's like all unfolding in very real time.
All right, thank you. Sadly, we're out of time, so I just want to thank you all for joining us, and please join us next month, November the 2nd, when we're going to hear from Konstantin Aliferis, who's the director of the Institute for Health Informatics and the Chief Research Informatics Officer at the University of Minnesota. And please go to our YouTube channel where the full webinar series is available for all of you to watch. Thank you so much. And Dr. McCoy, thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.